Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me for another episode of our ecology lesson. Today, what we're going to be talking about is energy flow, or how organisms go ahead and carry energy from one place to another, organism to organism, in an ecosystem. So let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, it would probably be a good idea to start with how do organisms get their energy? Well, it depends if they are a producer or a consumer. So an autotroph, remember an autotroph is anything that can make its own food, is a producer. These organisms create energy from the environment and inorganic molecules. For example, plants go ahead and make their energy through converting sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. Meanwhile, chemosynthesis is primarily carried out by organisms that don't have access to the sun, like tube worms down in the deep ocean near sulfur vents. They convert the chemicals just like how plants go ahead and convert the sunlight. The other option are for heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are consumers, meaning that they get their energy from consuming other organisms. For example, like this lion and zebra. The types of consumers. Now, there are a variety of different types of consumers. For example, we can have herbivores. These are organisms that only eat plants. For example, deer. Carnivores, which only eat other organisms. For example, a cougar or a mountain lion. We have omnivores, which are capable of eating both plants and animals depending on what the circumstances show and what's available to them. These include bears. Also, most humans are also omnivores. Most, not all. And finally, we have detritivores, also known as decomposers. These include both plants and animals, whose primary job it is to go ahead and recycle nutrients back to the environment. For example, bacteria, crabs, and other things like fungi and mushrooms are great examples of detritivores. Feeding relationships. So in an ecosystem, energy flows in one direction, primarily from the sun, or inorganic compounds, to the autotrophs, which use that energy input to go ahead and produce their food. So from the sun to the autotrophs, or producers, to the heterotrophs, or the consumers, and then ultimately back to the decomposers that get energy from decomposing dead organisms and recycle those nutrients back to the soil. So, in this example down here, we have the sun being used by the grass being eaten by the small consumers, the rabbits, and then the rabbits being consumed by the fox. Now, after the rabbit corpse has been left there for a while, it will eventually be decomposed, and the nutrients will go back to the soil. Normally, we consider this a food chain. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating or being eaten. So as you can see here, it always flows from your producers to your highest level consumers. And the arrow points in the direction of where the energy is going. So it goes from the grass, to the grasshopper, to the mouse, and eventually to the owl. Meanwhile, a food web is a network of complex feeding relationships. That's a little bit more realistic than a food chain. So this shows every feeding relationship inside the environment, or the habitat in which these organisms live. As you can see, it's a bit more complex, but it follows the same principles. So it goes from the producers at the bottom all the way up to the top level carnivores like the heron and the marsh hawk. Now, speaking of these, the steps in the food chain, or what eats what, are referred to as trophic levels. Each step in the food chain or food web is called a trophic level. At the bottom, we have our producers, which are our first trophic level. After that, we have our consumers, which go from secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, up to quaternary. So, as we continue through this, each trophic level depends on the energy from the one below it. So let's look at this one on the right. So here we have phytoplankton. This phytoplankton, the primary producer, is being consumed by the zooplankton. That zooplankton would be a primary consumer because it's eating the producer. Now, as we move forward, we have our secondary consumers. or the next consumer in the food chain. These salmon will be going ahead and eating the zooplankton, making them a secondary consumer. As we move up, we have our tertiary or third level consumer, the tuna. The tuna consumes the salmon. And then ultimately we have our top level carnivore, top level consumer, which is the orca or killer whale. So if we went ahead and removed even just one of these, for example, let's say we removed the zooplankton, the second step for the primary consumer. If we remove the zooplankton, everything before the zooplankton would start to grow in number. For example, our phytoplankton would start to grow very, very large in number. Meanwhile, everything after that would start to suffer. For example, the salmon couldn't eat the zooplankton, the tuna couldn't eat the salmon, and the killer whale couldn't eat the tuna. So each level depends on the one below it for energy. It's all interconnected. If you remove one, it affects everything, like a ripple in a pond. The energy pyramid. Now, as organisms go ahead and consume one another, only part of the energy gets passed on to the next level. Most energy is consumed for life processes and keeping the brain going. And eventually, all energy is released as heat. So roughly only 10% of the energy available within one trophic level is transferred to the one above it. So for example, as you can see here in this pyramid, the energy pyramid, we have our producers at the bottom, which have about 1,000 kilocalories or units of energy. Up next, only 10% of that is actually usable by the primary consumers, so only 100 kilocalories are available. As we move up to the shrews can only access about 10 kilocalories, and the owl at the top can access only 1. So as you can see, only 10% of the energy available gets passed on from one step to the next, which means that normally your tertiary consumers, or your high-level predators, have to go ahead and consume a bit more. They're not nearly as efficient at converting energy. They also need much more energy to go ahead and keep their bodies going. The last thing we're going to discuss today is called a biomass pyramid. So bio meaning life, mass meaning the amount of something that is present there. So biomass is the mass of living tissue at each level. This represents the total amount of living matter at each trophic level in an ecosystem. So the mass of producers is normally larger than the mass of consumers. So that means down here, in this example at the bottom, we have our producers, which represent roughly 1,000 kilograms. We have our herbivores, or our primary consumers, marking about 100 kilograms. Primary carnivores, 10 kilograms, and top carnivores, 1 kilogram. So namely, what we have here is it shows the amount of living tissue at each level. And that is going to go ahead and summarize today's lesson on ecological interactions, specifically talking about energy flow from one organism to the next, and how that energy is going ahead and being used as it goes on. So if you have any questions, please remember to go ahead and contact your teacher. They'll point you in the right direction. And until our next video, you all go ahead and take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time.